While Trump was posting about Golden Dome and 50% tariffs, Canada was in a room signing away the future of critical minerals without America. $12 billion committed, 12 allied nations involved, and the United States, the country most desperate for these minerals to break free from China, wasn't in that room. I'm going to break down exactly what Canada signed, who benefits, and why this might be the most consequential economic decision Ottawa has made in 20 years. Before we get into it, hit that subscribe button, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and stay until the end, because the second half of this story is where things get genuinely uncomfortable for Washington. Now, let's get into the numbers, because they matter more than the headlines. In early March of this year, Canada's Minister of Energy and Natural Resources stood in front of industry leaders and international partners and announced something that barely made a ripple in American media. 30 new critical minerals partnerships, $12.1 billion unlocked in mining project capital. 12 allied nations signed on. This wasn't a press release full of vague promises. These were actual agreements tied to actual mining and processing projects, backed by actual capital commitments from governments and private industry working together. Here's what makes this remarkable. Canada didn't build this deal around the United States. It built it around everyone else: Japan, South Korea, the European Union, countries that Washington has spent years trying to court into its own mineral security strategy. And Canada essentially skipped the middleman and went straight to them. Think about what that means for a second. The United States has spent the better part of 2 years talking about friend-shoring, bringing supply chains back to trusted allies instead of relying on China. Canada is sitting right next door, holds some of the largest untapped mineral reserves on the planet, and shares a border, a language, and a security alliance with America. And instead of America locking that relationship down first, other countries got there first. Let's talk about why this matters so much right now, because the backdrop here is critical. China currently processes more than 70% of the world's lithium, cobalt, graphite, and rare earth elements. Not mines, processes. That distinction is everything. A country can have all the raw ore in the ground it wants, but if it can't turn that ore into battery-grade material, magnet-grade material, usable industrial inputs, it's still dependent on Beijing. The United States Geological Survey's own assessment this year identified China as the dominant supplier for 14 of the 33 minerals the U.S. considers most critical to its economy and its defense industry. And the industries that rely on these processed materials, electric vehicles, semiconductors, defense systems, wind turbines, contributed roughly $4 trillion to the American economy last year alone. So, when China tightened export licensing on rare earth minerals and magnet derivatives, the alarm bells across Washington got louder. Everyone from defense contractors to auto manufacturers started asking the same question. Where do we get this stuff if not from China? Canada was supposed to be the obvious answer. Political proximity, existing infrastructure, relatively clean electricity for processing, a shared defense alliance. On paper, Canada is America's easiest and most logical partner to build an alternative mineral supply chain with. But here's where it gets interesting, and this is the part most people watching this trade story completely missed. At the exact same time Canada was expanding its mineral partnerships globally, it was locked in tense negotiations with the United States over trade. Washington wasn't just asking for cooperation on minerals. Reports have indicated the U.S. side pushed for something much bigger. A right of first refusal on Canadian critical minerals as part of a broader trade agreement, tied in some negotiations to Canada's purchase of American F-35 fighter jets. A right of first refusal. Think about what that phrase actually means in practice. It means before Canada sells its minerals to anyone else, Japan, South Korea, the EU, anyone, the United States gets the first right to buy them on its own terms. That's not a partnership. That's a chokehold dressed up as a trade agreement. And Canada's response wasn't a loud public rejection. It was quieter than that, and honestly more effective. Canada simply kept building relationships elsewhere. 30 deals, 12 countries, $12.1 billion in capital already moving. All of it happening in parallel with the trade negotiations, almost as if Ottawa was making sure it never had to say yes to exclusivity, because it already had other options on the table. This is a pattern worth paying attention to, because it tells you something about how Canada is approaching this entire relationship differently than it has in the past. For decades, Canada's economic playbook toward the United States was straightforward. Stay close, stay aligned, don't rock the boat, because 80% of Canadian exports go south of the border. That dependency gave Washington enormous leverage in any negotiation. But minerals are different. Minerals are the one area where Canada actually holds more cards than people realize. It's not oil, where pipeline infrastructure locks Canada into selling primarily to the US. It's not autos, where decades of integrated supply chains make separation painful for both sides. Minerals are something Canada can ship anywhere in the world, to any buyer willing to invest in the processing infrastructure. And that gives Ottawa a rare kind of independence in this relationship. Independence it appears to be using right now, in real time, while trade talks with Washington remain unresolved. So the question becomes, what happens next? What happens to American industries that assumed Canada would always be there as the fallback option? What happens to defense contractors depending on materials that might now be flowing to Seoul or Brussels instead of Detroit or Pittsburgh? And what does it say about the state of the U.S.-Canada relationship when America's own government pushed for exclusivity and it got partnership with everyone but itself instead? That's where we're headed next, and the details get a lot more specific. Let's get into what's actually at stake, because the numbers here go far beyond a single mining announcement. Start with the 20 allied nations Canada is now partnered with across 2 rounds of this critical minerals production alliance. This isn't just Japan, South Korea, and the European Union anymore. Canada's second round of partnerships in March pulled in a wider circle of countries, all racing to secure supply chains that don't run through Beijing. And every one of those deals represents capital, infrastructure, and long-term offtake agreements that used to be assumed as America's to lock down first, simply by virtue of geography and alliance. Here's the part that should genuinely concern anyone watching the American manufacturing and defense sectors. Global critical minerals investment actually declined by 9% last year. Battery mineral spending fell more than 20%. Lithium investment alone dropped by roughly 40%. The world is pulling back on mineral investment at the exact moment demand for EVs, defense systems, and grid infrastructure is accelerating. That makes every dollar of committed capital exponentially more valuable. And Canada just locked in $12.1 billion of it, with countries other than the United States, while global investment was shrinking everywhere else. Now let's bring this back to something Americans can actually feel in their own economy. The defense industry runs on rare earth magnets for guidance systems, radar, and electric motors in military vehicles. The auto industry runs on lithium, cobalt, and graphite for EV batteries. Semiconductor manufacturing depends on gallium and germanium. Both minerals Canada explicitly named as part of its co-investment strategy in recent years. If Canada's newest processing capacity, backed by this fresh capital, ends up prioritizing contracts with South Korean battery makers or Japanese automakers instead of American ones, U.S. companies don't just lose a convenient neighbor, they lose pricing power, delivery priority, and leverage in a market where China already holds most of the cards. And here's where the political backdrop makes this even more pointed. Prime Minister Mark Carney has been blunt about this in public statements, saying access to Canada's critical minerals for the United States is not, in his words, assured, not guaranteed, not automatic. That's a significant shift in tone from a country that has spent generations treating the U.S. relationship as untouchable, no questions asked. Carney has also pushed back specifically on the idea of granting Washington first refusal rights over Canadian minerals, even as trade negotiators discussed tying that access to Canada, completing its F-35 fighter jet purchases, a deal reportedly worth billions on its own. So picture the leverage dynamic here. The United States wants exclusive or priority access to minerals it desperately needs to compete with China. Canada is being asked to give up pricing flexibility and buyer choice on a resource it has spent years diversifying deliberately. And instead of folding, Canada quietly built an insurance policy, 30 international partnerships deep, before that negotiation even concluded. This is where the American consumer and worker actually enter the picture, because trade abstractions like this always eventually show up in real prices and real jobs. If Canadian minerals increasingly flow toward Asian and European processing hubs instead of American ones, U.S. manufacturers may face higher input costs, longer supply chains, and more exposure to the very China dependency this entire push was supposed to eliminate. Meanwhile, Canadian regions, Ontario, Quebec, the western provinces that recently signed their own shared minerals strategy, stand to capture the mining jobs, the processing jobs, and the capital investment that used to be assumed as North American, meaning largely American-controlled. There's also a defense angle that doesn't get enough attention. Golden Dome, the missile defense system Trump has floated at a $61 billion price tag for Canadian participation, depends on the same category of rare earth and specialty minerals at the center of this entire story. You cannot build space-based interceptors, radar arrays, and next-generation defense architecture without secure access to gallium, rare earth magnets, and specialty alloys. If Canada is simultaneously being asked to fund a missile shield and hand over first refusal rights on the very minerals that SHIELD requires, while also signing away allocation to other countries, the entire negotiating position becomes a lot messier than a simple yes or no trade deal. What's happening here is bigger than one mining announcement. It's a signal that Canada, for the first time in a long time, is treating its natural resources as genuine geopolitical leverage rather than an automatic export to its southern neighbor. Whether that leverage gets used to extract a better trade deal from Washington, or whether it permanently redirects Canadian mineral wealth toward Tokyo, Seoul, and Brussels, is still an open question. But the $12.1 billion already committed, and the 12 nations already at the table, tell you which direction the momentum is currently moving. And that's a reality American industry, American defense planners, and American trade negotiators are going to have to reckon with, whether Washington was in the room for that announcement or not. If this breakdown gave you a clearer picture of what's really happening between Canada and the United States on critical minerals, make sure you're subscribed, because this story is far from finished. Drop a comment with your take. Do you think Canada made the right move, or is this going to backfire? Thanks for watching all the way through, and I'll see you in the next one.